I'm Nima Rajan. Federal Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos says access to PCR tests for COVID-19 is at a crisis point across the country. Many provinces and territories have decided to restrict the more trustworthy molecular testing to individuals at a higher risk of being hospitalized from COVID or are in settings where the virus could spread more quickly. Minister Duclos says that's why the at-home rapid antigen tests have become such a crucial tool to combat this wave's fast-spreading Omicron variant. Ottawa has promised to deliver 140 million rapid tests to provinces by the end of the month. Meanwhile, the federal government is backing down from its order that Canadian truckers crossing into Canada would need to be fully vaccinated by this Saturday. The Canada Border Services Agency now says Canadian big riggers will not have to quarantine if they are unvaccinated or have received only one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. The new rule will still apply to American truckers. Trucking associations on both sides of the border were urging the government to delay the restriction, claiming that it would further strain supply chains as COVID-19 infections surge. Canada is joining Mexico in asking for a dispute resolution panel to challenge Washington's stance on new rules for duty-free trucks and cars. Rules of origin dictate how much of a product must originate in the region in order to qualify for tariff-free status. Canada says the U.S. is violating the agreement by adopting a stricter formula for how those thresholds are met. Quebec's opposition party believes the provincial government's plan to tax adults who are not vaccinated against COVID-19 won't get off the ground. Liberal health critic Monsef Daraji thinks the idea that Premier François Legault announced on Tuesday will be abandoned in the same way that the Legault government dropped its plan to force healthcare workers to get the jab or be suspended without pay. He predicts the punitive trial balloon will pop in a month or so, and Mr. Daraji says the announcement was aimed at drawing attention away from the previous night's resignation of Quebec's public health director. A report by an 11-member expert panel says Canada needs to up its game when it comes to collecting data on climate-related disasters. Canada used to experience fewer than 30 climate-related disasters in a decade, but now averages more than 100. The panel says the country is not doing enough to reduce the effects of climate change and that a lack of comprehensive data on the risks, the costs, and the possible solutions is often preventing action. While the House of Commons is still scheduled to resume sitting January 31st, the Senate will extend its holiday break by an extra week before resuming work in Ottawa. Senate Speaker George Furey says after consulting with the leadership of the various groups in the upper house, the chamber will remain adjourned until February 8th. The Speaker can extend an adjournment if the public interest does not require the upper house to meet as originally scheduled. The Pan American Health Organization is predicting Omicron will become the predominant COVID-19 variant in the Americas in the coming weeks. Confirmed cases have already reached record levels. The health agency says cases across the Americas almost doubled to 6.1 million by early last week, which is up 250% from last January. Meanwhile, Manitoba's government says everyone will likely be exposed to COVID-19 in the coming weeks. And that belief is driving Manitoba to shift its efforts away from trying to contain the spread of the Omicron variant and mitigate its impact. The province's Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Jaz Atwal, says Omicron is so much more transmissible than the previous variants, and that it's more important now to focus on getting more people vaccinated, testing people in higher risk settings, and boosting hospital capacity. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce wants Premier Doug Ford's government to let businesses that are shut down by the pandemic reopen on the 26th of this month. President and CEO Rocco Rossi says with students returning to school on Monday, it's time to provide clarity for businesses. The closures limited restaurants to takeout and applied to museums, zoos, gyms, indoor recreation facilities, cinemas, and indoor concert venues. BC's Ministry of Transportation says Highway 1 between Lytton and Spence's Bridge will partially open on Friday. Crews have been working to clear, repair, and reopen the highway, which was damaged in 15 places between Hope and Spence's Bridge by major rain and flooding in November. Officials add the highway between Lytton and Hope is still closed as work has been delayed because of record snowfall and the risk of avalanches. All right, stay tuned. We'll be back after the break with more news from around the world. Up next, we discuss household financial resiliency as Canada continues to battle its way through the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll have an interview with Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited, when we return. And following that, more news from around the world, of course. So stay with us. We'll be right back on Forum Daily News. As Canada continues on its path to recovery from the pandemic's impact on the economy and the health system, there's a growing need for households to maintain and improve their financial resilience. This comes as Canadians have experienced change in their work-life patterns, their school life patterns, and the movement of everyday life in this new pandemic-era normal. So what are some steps that Canadians can take to improve their finances in 2022 and beyond? Well, to help us out with that in our weekly finance and investment segment is Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Nima, always great to be here. Thank you.
Always great to have you, Brendan. So how can investors take better charge of their finances in 2022?
Well, I think there's a number of things you can do. I was listening to your introduction as people get back to normal, hopefully. I cannot either confirm nor deny I knocked wood at that point in time when I heard you say that. How can people take care of, and I didn't know how you're going to finish this sentence, so I was thinking, take some vitamin D, because people need to get out and get some sun, particularly in the middle of winter. But I think probably the single most important thing for people and their finances is to put a little bit of money aside every month, just enough that you notice it. If that's $50, it's $50. If it's $500 or $5,000, some amount of money that they just noticed to put aside, hopefully in something that is both liquid and can grow. Banks are fine, but having that $50 or $500 grow and compound every month in something that has the ability to participate in whatever is going right in the market will mean that over a year or two or three, when you need that money, it will not have just sat there at the current low interest rates, but will have actually done something for you.
All right, Brendan. Well, let's get into some of the investment resources out there. I've heard a lot of people talk about an emergency fund, especially during this pandemic. How important is it to have one, and what exactly does an emergency fund look like?
It looks like different things for different people. As I say, some people's emergency fund are under their floorboards or their mattress. That's a way of doing it. Going into the Y2K crisis of 20 odd years ago, you may have read, since you may not remember, people were buying gold and hoarding it in their basements. But I think the best way for most people is to add something to a mutual fund that can grow. 50, 500, 100, some number, because the dollar cost averaging effect is as true today as when David Chilton wrote The Wealthy Barber going on 40 years ago about how you can put a little money aside in something that can go up or down on any given month. You're buying more when it's lower and less when it's higher, dollar cost averaging.
All right, Brendan. Well, I know a lot of our younger viewers may be hearing about tax-free savings accounts. So what are the benefits of a TFSA?
Well, it was something that the last Conservative federal government came up with as a way of encouraging people to save. And while you don't get any tax deductions for putting money into a TFSA, the money inside it accumulates without incurring any taxes. And you can then withdraw that also without incurring taxes. So it is a way of, if there is a stock you like, you want to buy the next big investment in whatever the next meta stock is, a TFSA is not a bad way for the next generation, or indeed any generation, to have those investments that they see accumulating over time. I believe the amount you can put in each month is $6,000. Sorry, not each month, each year is $6,000, but that accumulates over time. So if you've been around for a while, as well, at least I have, the limit can get quite big, into the tens of thousands.
All right, Brendan. Well, as we get older, we hear about RRSPs. So when is the best time to invest in an RRSP?
Well, that's a good one. A TFSA is good to start when you're 18, because it's you can own a mutual fund, you can own anything in a TFSA, and it's not really a tax-driven product. The RSP was designed as a way for people who didn't have pensions to accumulate money like they do, like have a pension. So it's one's own personal pension, if you will. And a good time to start is when you're starting to notice that you're paying taxes. So if you're starting to get up to the point where taxes become a thing, then I would start looking at putting money into your RSP, because you get a tax deduction for putting money in. Now, you also pay tax when you withdraw money, either when it's an RSP or when you retire and it's a registered income fund or retirement income fund. But so it makes sense to start putting money in once you're paying taxes, because it reduces your income in the year that you make the contribution. And actually right now, January, February, one can make a contribution for the previous year. So you can actually get a tax deduction against 2021 by making a contribution now in 2022.
Some great advice as always, Brendan. Thank you again for joining us today.
Nima, always great to be here. Thank you.
Stay with us. After the break, we take a deeper look at the response to Iran's downing of a passenger jet. Family members of those killed when Iran's military shot down a passenger jet 2 years ago are demanding the case go before the International Civil Aviation Organization and for the RCMP to launch a criminal investigation. The Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims is also calling for arrest warrants and government sanctions against senior Iranian political and military leaders, and for the designation of Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. Nearly 140 of the 176 people killed in the January 8, 2020 incident had ties to Canada. And with us to discuss the sanctions and legal process is Ms. Sarah Teach. She is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a legal advisor to the coalition, or the Canadian Coalition Against Terror. She is also one of the 5 legal advisors to the PS 752 Association. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, ma'am, so let's start with this. Can you briefly remind our viewers of the events leading to the downing of Flight PS 752?
Of course. So the downing of Flight PS 752 came amidst escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. It was on January 3rd, that's just 5 days before the crash, that Qasem Soleimani was assassinated by a U.S. drone strike. And less than 24 hours before the flight was downed by 2 missiles, the IRGC also attacked empty U.S. bases in Iraq. And then mere hours later, the 2 missiles were shot and downed Flight PS 752, killing everybody on board.
All right, ma'am. Well, we know the Ontario Superior Court recently ruled that the missile attacks were intentional and an act of terrorism. So what does that mean for the families of the victims?
So more than that, they actually also awarded compensation, including punitive damages. And to my knowledge, that's the first time that a superior court in Ontario has ever done that in a case of a terrorist act. So it's highly significant. Only a handful of families were involved in that civil lawsuit, but what it means for them is that Iranian assets in Canada, at least excluding diplomatic property, can be seized and sold, and the proceeds used to compensate family members. It also sets a precedent potentially for the other family members that were involved, and perhaps they could go to court as well.
And how has the Iranian government responded so far to this?
So this last week was the anniversary of the killing of Soleimani, the attack on the U.S. air bases, and the downing of Flight PS 752. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Iranian regime has focused on the former two and not focused on the downing of Flight PS 752. So what we saw most strikingly, perhaps, was that for the 2-year anniversary of the killing of Soleimani, Iran imposed sanctions on more U.S. officials.
All right, ma'am. Well, we mentioned the Ontario Superior Court's recent move, but what has the Canadian federal government done so far to address the attack?
Canada is part of a coordination and response group. So that includes not just Canada, but also Sweden, the UK, countries that had citizens on board the flight. So that group recently came out with a statement acknowledging that further negotiations with Iran would be futile and that next steps would be taken to seek accountability in international law. So hopefully then what comes next is those action steps precisely, with Canada in concert with these other countries seeking remedies using international law.
All right. Well, we mentioned that the association that's representing the families of the victims is calling for stronger action, including designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. So what is the significance of this, and is this a realistic ask?
For sure, it's realistic. It should have happened a long time ago. The Quds Force is already a listed terrorist entity in Canada. The Quds Force is the part of the IRGC that engages in clandestine operations abroad, funding terrorist proxies all over the region. So what this downing further proves, we already knew this, but what it shows is that the IRGC is also committing terrorist acts domestically in the airspace over Tehran. So certainly the entire IRGC should be listed.
All right, well, just about a minute left in this interview, ma'am, but what are you watching for as this case progresses?
I'm watching for, the case to progress, for Canada to continue on those next steps that it's indicated that it will do. Watching for Canada to use international legal mechanisms to hold Iran to account and seek justice for the family members.
All right, just 30 seconds left in this interview, but where can our viewers go to learn more about the Canadian Coalition Against Terror?
CCAT has a website. There's also a Twitter. It's all over the internet. Check it out. As well, the PS 752 Association. I'd encourage interested viewers to check out their website and their Twitter. You could also follow me on Twitter, and I post regularly about both organizations.
Ms. Sarah Teach, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break with a look at news from around the world as Russia says it could deploy troops to Cuba and Venezuela. That and more coming up shortly after the break. Russia's deputy foreign minister is warning that Moscow could deploy soldiers to Cuba and Venezuela if tensions with the United States keep rising over Ukraine. Monday's talks in Geneva and yesterday's NATO-Russia meeting in Vienna failed to narrow the gap on Moscow's security demands as Russia builds up troops near Ukraine. The Russian diplomat says the U.S. and NATO have rejected the key Russian demand for guarantees that NATO won't expand into Ukraine and other ex-Soviet nations. Talks between Indian and Chinese military commanders on easing a 20-month border standoff have ended without a breakthrough for the second time in 3 months. India's defense ministry says the two sides had a frank and in-depth exchange of views in the meeting on Wednesday, and they would work to resolve the remaining issues without specifying them. The previous round of commander-level talks in October also ended in a stalemate. India and China have stationed tens of thousands of soldiers backed by artillery, tanks, and fighter jets along their de facto border called the Line of Actual Control. China is defending what it calls historical rights to virtually the entire South China Sea. This is following a new U.S. government report saying Beijing's claims are almost entirely invalid. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson called the State Department report an attempt to distort international law, confuse the public, sow discord, and disrupt the regional situation. The U.S. report says China's territorial claims are vague and have no legal basis. China, meanwhile, again rejected a 2016 international arbitration ruling that mostly invalidated its vast maritime claims. The region has been tense because 6 other governments claim all or part of the vital waterway. India and Britain have launched talks on a free trade deal, which is expected to boost bilateral trade by billions of dollars in one of the most ambitious negotiations after Brexit. Britain's International Trade Secretary, Anne-Marie Travellin, met with Piyush Goyal, India's Minister of Commerce and Industry, in New Delhi before formal talks next week. Minister Goyal said the free trade agreement, expected to be finalized in 1 year, will double the current trade of $50 billion by 2030. The European Union has rejected the merger between South Korean shipbuilders Hyundai and Daewoo. Officials said on Thursday that a union between the two of the world's biggest players in the industry would have given the merged company a global stranglehold on the production of liquefied natural gas carriers. EU Competition Commissioner Margrethe Vestager says the merger would have led to fewer suppliers and higher prices for large vessels transporting LNG. European customers account for almost half of the orders in the $45 billion market. Hyundai Heavy Industries Holdings called the decision disappointing and said it would pursue possible measures, including an appeal. Meanwhile, Europe's natural gas crisis isn't letting up. Prices are high, reserves that are relied on in cold weather are low, and major Russian supplier Gazprom isn't selling gas like it used to. Pipeline operators say that if there's a cold winter, the continent's gas companies will need to import more than they have in the past. Whether more gas is out there to be had is the big question. Analysts claim prices have been so high recently, tankers loaded with liquid gas headed for Asia have been turning around in the middle of the ocean to take advantage of lucrative sales in Europe. The Nigerian government has lifted its ban on Twitter today. This is 7 months after the West African country's more than 200 million people were shut out of the social media network. The shift came after Twitter agreed to meet some of Nigeria's conditions, including opening an office there. United Nations World Food Program senior official Mary Ellen McWherty is warning that Afghanistan is facing a tsunami of hunger due to a shortage of funds. In an interview with the Associated Press, the WFP leader in Afghanistan urged the international community to put humanitarian necessity above political discussions. This to ensure aid money keeps reaching the Taliban-run country. According to the UN humanitarian organization, 22.8 million people face acute food shortages, including 8.7 million close to starvation. A rare first edition of William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies has been acquired by the University of British Columbia. The book was published in 1623, 7 years after his death, and includes 36 of his plays. It is considered to be the most comprehensive and authoritative of all the early printings of the plays, and only 235 copies are believed to exist around the world. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.